Good evening, everyone. My name is Stephen Woolfolk. I'm the Director of Programming for the Kansas City Public Library. And thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to everybody who is watching from home for what I think is a very important library program. It's been difficult to miss the debate around transgender rights in America. If you were plugged in during the campaign season, you might even have seen an ad or two. I am not here to tell you that this topic is an easy one. It's not. There are a lot of questions to which I do not feel I have a good answer to. Questions about fairness in sports and gender-affirming care for minors. But what I do understand is how we find those answers. And we find them by being willing to listen and by being willing to ask and answer difficult questions. So that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to listen, and then there will be an opportunity for you all to ask questions. You can do that at any time using this text line right to my left. And Schuyler has told me he wants your difficult questions, so make them hard. Here's my ask of you. Simple, I hope. 1, keep an open mind tonight. 2, treat everyone in this room with the same level of respect that you would expect to be treated with. We want everyone to have an opportunity to engage, but we want everyone to also remember that the library does not tolerate harassment or profane language, including hate speech. And 3, please do not behave in a way that prevents others from enjoying their evening. Simple, right? Before I introduce Schuyler, I want to give a special thank you to a co-sponsor this evening. We have some representatives on hand from the City of Fountain Sisters, part of the International Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to promote universal joy and expiate stigmatic guilt. Thank you for being here, thank you for your help promoting this event, and thank you for your service to our community. Tonight I am honored to have an opportunity to introduce Schuyler Bailar, a transgender man, inclusion advocate, and LGBTQ+ educator. Schuyler is more than familiar with the myriad questions surrounding the transgender community, and in his new book, He, She, They, How We Talk About Gender and Why It Matters, he answers many of those questions in an effort to pave the way to understanding, acceptance, and inclusion. The book is available for purchase right outside here, courtesy of our good friends at Bliss Books and Wine, and Schuyler will be signing copies following the event. Now, please join me in welcoming to Kansas City, Schuyler Bailar.
Wonderful. Hi, everybody. I was told that I get to use my little lapel mic so I can wander around because I'm an athlete, or so I once was. So I'm gonna be moving a little bit. Steve, thanks so much for the introduction. I'm so happy to be here in Kansas City with you all. The last time I was here was for a speech at the KCAI, Kansas City Art Institute, and I really could not wrap my head around the fact that Kansas City was also in Missouri, and I really struggled on that. So this time, I'm sure of it, we are in Missouri, right? I'm really excited to be here. I was also told, prepped, that there was a bit of a protest outside. Maybe some of you walked by it. Who walked by it? Okay, like 20 of you, cool. They left at 5:30, so they only got 20 of you. I get the luxury of coming in the back entrance, so I didn't get to see it, I was like kind of disappointed because I kind of like looking at the signs to see what they come up with, because every once in a while, like 1 in 100 protests, there are new signs, right? Like something creative. But unfortunately, they told me the signs just had a Genesis quote on it. So just the same old, same old. There were 6 of them, I was also told, and they were cold. So somebody needs to give them like a hug or something. Anyways. I'm like starting off with this partially because it's what's on my mind, but also because when I think about you all gathered here and us gathered here to talk about the things that we're going to talk about today, I think a lot about the reasons that we're here. And we're here partially because you all want to hear what I have to say theoretically, but we're also here because of this massive conversation that the country is currently undergoing. And it's not always a conversation, it's largely a screaming fight, right? That has been bolstered, empowered, funded, resourced by really powerful and hateful people that are causing a lot of people, like those 6 people outside, to channel their hatred and their energy in really, really unproductive ways. Right? We're not here because trans people are a problem. We're not here because trans people threaten sports or healthcare or bathrooms or schools. We're here because somebody decided that trans people are a really good political pawn. that talking about us is incredibly effective at dividing communities, right? At accruing votes. That's why $215 million were spent on anti-trans ads in the last presidential election campaign, right? So when I think about that and I think about showing up here, I feel this sort of tension between knowing that you all are deeply loving and committed to this work and that's why you're here, or you're curious and that works too, and I'm really excited that you're here, but we're also here because of this really horrible anti-movement, right? And I think that we can't really conceptualize these conversations without thinking about that. And that's really what I tried to enter this conversation with writing the book, because a lot of misinformation is being perpetuated about trans people with the intent to demonize us, right? Not to actually share facts, not to rely on science, not to advance science, but intentionally trying to demonize and other us with the intent of gaining control and power. So I've been traveling the country for about 10 years now. I came out in 2014 as a trans man, and then I started on the men's team at Harvard, being the first openly trans man to do so on a men's team in college, on a D1 men's team in college in 2015. So again, it's been about 10 years since then, and before I graduated from college, which was 2019, I had given 102 speeches. So I spent most of my years in college, not actually in college. I spent most of it traveling either for swimming and swim meets or for doing speeches. And during that time, I consistently shared my story as this trans athlete. I talked about what it meant to be trans, and I educated people on my identity. And it was really interesting because in the first couple years that I was giving this speech, most people, when I said, hey, who can define the word transgender? Most people couldn't. Most people hadn't heard the word frequently. If anything, they had read it when they were reading about me, and it was about like the man who used to be a woman, and it was really reductive language, right? It was a really different place 10 years ago when we talked about transness, because there wasn't this national, international conversation about us. So I was doing these speeches then, and if we fast forward to now, I think transgender is a bit of a household word now. Pretty much everybody has heard this word. Whether or not they can define it correctly is another story, but many people know about this topic. And people have asked me, Schuyler, how has the work changed from when you first started doing this in 2014, 2015 to now in 2024? And my answer is that it's gotten more difficult. And the reason is because now, when I say this is who I am, I'm immediately asked all of these questions or demanded to answer all of these questions about trans people in sports, trans people in bathrooms, trans people and gender-affirming care. I'm immediately challenged as soon as I say that I'm trans, because people are filled with disinformation, right? Incorrect things that really isn't information. It's lies, it's propaganda, but they're filled with this. Whereas at the beginning, when I first started this work, I said I'm transgender, people said, what's that? Right? And so I got to start from zero. But now, a lot of times, we're starting from a negative value because people have the wrong information. And my expectation or assumption is that many of you are having these conversations as well with your loved ones or with people around you, and that's why you're here. And maybe that's why you're interested in my book, or maybe you already bought it, because you're trying to figure out how to have these conversations from a grounded, scientific, humanity-centric place, right? And that's difficult. And one of the things that I've thought a lot about as I've done this work, especially meeting a lot of other trans people, is that when I talk about these subjects, and this is all my whole life is this. I travel to do speaking. I talk about it online on Instagram. I talk about it in person. People ask me about it in my personal life. I'm constantly talking about these topics. So I have a litany of facts and arguments always in my head about these things. But I have a lot of trans friends who will say to me, Schuyler, I don't know the answers to these questions. I don't know all of the science behind trans people in sports or why trans people deserve trans medical care. I just know that they do. I don't know how to have these conversations, and I don't want to. And I really want to honor that, right? If you are sitting in this audience, you're thinking, gosh, I don't know all of these facts. I don't want to know all these facts. All I know is that this discrimination is wrong. Yeah, I'm with you. I think that is actually really core right here. And we're going to talk about all the facts, and I'm going to hopefully share with you some information that's helpful. But I want to sort of encapsulate it all with this reminder that we don't actually have to understand everything. We don't actually have to have a dissertation of sources in order to know what's right. We can know what's right and not be able to explain it all. We actually know a lot of things about the world that many of you cannot explain. Anybody here know how a cell phone works? I sure as hell don't. Okay, I got one hand, cool. Great, you can explain to us later. My point is, if I pick up the phone and I call my wife, I have no idea how she's appearing on FaceTime, but she is, and it's working, right? We can't explain it, but we know it works, all right? We can apply that to so many other things, but I think we should especially apply it to identities, right? To marginalized identities specifically, because so many of us are expected to write dissertations in order to explain our identities and justify how we show up. But that's so unrealistic. We don't all have the capacity to do that. And the core is really emotional, actually. Again, humanity-centric. How can I just see you for who you are and affirm that? This, right before I came in here, I went to the bathroom. I'm giving you more information than you probably need, but I'm telling you anyways. I went to the bathroom. I always do that before I do a talk. And I think especially today, as I am here, I walked into the men's bathroom. But if you go to this is way too much information, but I'm telling you anyways. The bathroom, when you walk straight, it's the women's, and you have to turn to go to the men's. So I was walking into the bathroom, and I was like, oh, there's the women's, I shouldn't go there. And I turned into the men's, and then I thought to myself, there are so many states right now that would want to force me to go into the women's. And I thought, wow, what a privilege it is that I get to walk into the men's bathroom and not be harassed in this bathroom. But as I went to the bathroom, somebody else came in, and I felt the same panic that I have in much of my life, where I thought, oh my gosh, what if somebody throws me out? Because I've been thrown out of more bathrooms than I can count, especially in my childhood. And I thought to myself, gosh, what a privilege when I walked out and nobody threw me out of the bathroom. Again, what a privilege it is that I am able to walk out of this bathroom unscathed, that nobody is yelling at me, nobody is screaming at me. And I really, I see that as a privilege, but this really shouldn't be a privilege. And then I thought to myself, think about all of the bathrooms in the world that are gender neutral. Right? Like the ones in your house, unless you have signs on your bathrooms in your house, which I think you probably don't, where there's no problems and we just use the bathrooms, right? And so I'm sort of expanding on this thought, but what I'm trying to share is that there are so many things that people are fighting against. We have a protest at the Capitol today about bathrooms because of the recent bill that was introduced trying to stop the first transgender congresswoman from using the women's bathroom in the Capitol, and now affecting many other trans people who work in the Capitol. They're fighting about bathrooms trying to protect women while hurting women trying to protect women, right? You can't really make it make sense. And I think this statistic I read recently really struck me. So in 2020, right at the beginning of all of these anti-trans laws that, like the bathroom laws, we had 0 anti-trans healthcare bans, right? We had 0 healthcare bans for transgender healthcare. Now, there are 25 states at least that have these bans. Right. And in the same vein, I, as you all know, I'm a trans athlete. I competed in the men's category as a transgender man. And when I was competing, we had 0 transgender bans. If you were trans, you could compete in sports, both elite, like NCAA, the Olympics, and at state level in schools. Now, in 26 states, trans kids are banned from playing sports with their friends. And as I was saying earlier, I've been traveling the country speaking about my experience for the last 10 years. And oftentimes they put a little bio for me and they say, inspirational speaker, motivational speaker. And I think to myself now, how can you inspire somebody to do something that is banned in 26 states? 26 states, children in those states cannot do what I did, compete as themselves, play the sports with their friends. That is devastating. And unfortunately, it's the product not of science, not of fact, not of logic, but of cruel, power-hungry, mostly men, right? People in power. And I share that, and I want to transition soon into inviting questions, actually, because I think that this is a really critical conversation to have with each other. So I'm really going to invite you to ask questions, and you can text your questions there. But I share the facts about the states that you probably know some of these things, the 559 bills that were proposed this year, anti-trans bills. You probably know these things, but I share it not to bring us down, but actually to really remind us of who we're fighting for. Right? Why we are showing up here. I started my talk today with sharing that we're here because of the love in this room, but we're also here because of the hate outside. All 6 of them. But the, hundreds of thousands of others elsewhere, right? We're here because we have a real task ahead of us. And the task is going to get more difficult over the next 4 years as we shift into the next presidency. It is going to get more difficult. And people have asked me, Schuyler, How do you feel about the election results? How do you feel going into the next 4 years? What do you think is going to happen? And my answer is I am a short-term pessimist, but I am a long-term optimist. And what I mean by that is I think it's going to get worse for the next several years. I do. And not necessarily because we are going to get worse. Of course, we're going to work really hard. But because we're going to go up against really difficult opponents, really well-funded opponents, really unified opponents. But we're going to get through it because we always have. And the hope that I have is actually long-term as well, long-term in the future, but long-term in the past. I am here as an openly trans person who competed in sports, who is a mixed-race person of color because of the product of so many amazing people who fought before me. Right? Transcestors who fought for my rights as a trans person. But I'm also here because they fought against anti-miscegenation laws, for example. My parents, when they were born, couldn't get married because they were of different races. All right? So if we think about so many different, I just named that because this is intersectional. There are so many things that have allowed me to be here and talk to you all today about who I am that are about history, that are about different people in the past who were silenced, who were marginalized, who were jailed, who were murdered, but we still have moved to this point. And so I have a lot of long-term hope that we're going to keep moving forwards, but it's going to require one specific thing I want to highlight to you, which is us working together. Those people outside, all 6 of them, they're very, very unified. Maybe not those 6, they kind of petered out quickly, but the general anti-trans fight, right? The general 72 million people that voted against my rights, right? Those people are really good at unifying. They are having dinner every Friday night. They are liking every post that everybody does. They don't care if they actually agree. They agree on everything because that is how they win. And us, we're not so good at that. We fight a lot, right? And we actually fight for really good reasons. It's because we value nuance. But is there a way to both value nuance and unity at the same time? Is there a way to value coming together instead of driving ourselves apart? Is there a way to find common humanity? Because one of the most important things that I've learned through all the different speeches that I've given, especially to audiences that I never think that I identified with. For example, one of my early speeches, I was, where was I? I was in, I think it was North Carolina, which is, despite the north part, is very much the south. So I was in North Carolina, a rural town, and I went to this school, and they invited, get this, they invited all of the athletes and all of the queer people. It's a very cool combo of people, all right? They were forcing the athletes to come, and they invited the queer people to come. And when I say queer people, I mean like the QSA, right? Like the Queer Student Alliance. So we had all of these teams, right? The men's basketball team, the men's baseball team, the men's volleyball team, the women's volleyball team, the women's, okay, right, you get the point. And then there's a little group of people who are also all the queer folks that banded together. Okay, so we've got all the different people there. Again, the teams are required to be there. And I'm thinking to myself, gosh, there's so little I have in common with so many of these guys, especially these guys, the baseball guys. They were sitting up in the back and they were snickering at me the whole time. They were laughing at me. They had made comments, like you could kind of hear it because it was one of those auditoriums where you could hear the sound. And I thought to myself, what am I going to say that's going to resonate with these guys? How am I going to connect with all of these people? And will they actually value what I have to say because they're being forced to be here? But when the speech ended, and I had to do some crowd control. There was a couple, like I said, a couple people snickering. But when I finished, several of the guys from the teams actually came up to talk to me. And there was one guy I really remember, and he said he was from the wrestling team. And he said, hey, what you shared really resonated with me. I've felt that way too. I've felt like I didn't belong in this space. I've really struggled with understanding my mental health, and I've never known how to talk about it with my teammates. I'm so glad that you shared that because I've felt those things too. And other guys then shared that, and at every speech since that, when there are people who I don't think I'm going to resonate with, people who I don't share identities with, they'll come up and they'll say, hey, that resonated with me. I felt that too. I felt not enough. I felt like I didn't belong. I felt like I wasn't man enough at some point in my life. And these people are not necessarily trans. They're all not people of color. We don't share identities, but they feel what I feel. Why? Because we're all human. And these moments have been so powerful for me because I think they really reinforce that trans people are not this other that everybody wants to make us believe that we are, that we do share far more than that separates us. And I think that when we think about trans people as those people over there, even if we're trying to be allies to trans people, I get a lot of comments about, oh, Schuyler, it's so hard for you, and it's like putting me in a box over there of trans is so far from them. But when we do that, we forget that each and every single one of you also has a gender. You have an experience with gender, and therefore you have been limited by the gender binary at some point in your life. And that's why these comments from mostly these men, and whether they're basketball team members, wrestling team members, or bankers somewhere, they say, I felt that too, because they too have been limited by the ways they are expected to show up in their gender. And so when I think about gender liberation, which is really what we're fighting for here, when I think about this type of liberation, it doesn't just benefit trans people like myself, it benefits all of us. It benefits every single one of you, because all of you have been forced into a box in some way, told you're not man enough, not woman enough, too masculine, too feminine, too something, that you have to change. You have to fit this box. You have to be that way. Don't sit that way. Don't talk that way. Don't like those things. We all have something to gain from liberating ourselves from these boxes, and therefore we all have something to gain from this gender liberation. I said earlier I wanted to open up for questions. I really do. I want this to be a conversation. I'm done babbling at you about the things that you didn't ask me about. I'm going to invite you to ask questions. You'll use this little texting thing. So you'll text that if you have a question, and then where is my friend who's going to read them to me? Somebody's going to read them to me, and we'll go from there. I want to say, though, I really do want you to ask the questions you're genuinely curious about. We have a little sense of anonymity here, so you won't have to be named, which is exciting for you, not for me. So you can ask whatever questions you like. I truly mean this. A lot of people kind of get stuck and they get worried when they're asking trans people questions. I think we're going to bite them or explode or something. I promise I won't do any of those things. I really do want you to ask the questions you're curious about. I give speeches to a lot of different kinds of people, and one of my favorite audiences is kindergartners, and I'll tell you why. Kindergartners have absolutely no filter, okay? And what's great about this is that they say what they mean and they mean what they say. So today, I'm going to ask you, access your inner kindergartner, have no filter, ask the question that you have. We will try our best. Well, it has to make it through the censorship, but I've told them, don't censor it so that I can answer the question in the words that you have. Don't stress about not having the right words. We'll walk through it together, okay? I'm an open book, not a punching bag. I'm not asking you to be mean to me, though I don't think that's going to be an issue, and I will do my best to answer whatever questions you have. Okay, I'm going to also move this. It's bothering me. I'm going to trip on it or something. Okay, go ahead.
As per your request, I am going to be reading these word for word.
Great.
Since November, do you have any advice for balancing sensibly preparing for the future while also staying hopeful and emotionally afloat?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the day that the election results came out, a friend of mine who is a transgender woman, she texted me and she said, Schuyler, I trust your opinion. Do we go into hiding? We're not safe anymore. What do we do? And this is her word for word question, do we go into hiding? And I sat and I sort of stared at my phone for a while because I really didn't know what to say. The answer is yes, but also no, right? It's sure, but I don't want you to have to, but if you have to, you have to. What do you do? I don't know. What I ended up saying is I think it's really individual. I think that what's going to happen is going to be really state-based. So on a logistical standpoint, what's going to happen is really based on state governments and how state governments respond. Of course, federal mandates are going to make a change as well, but they're not going to probably change every single state depending on what each state does. So I think it's going to be really state-based. That's like a logistical thing. I don't think everybody has to go into hiding, but I also validate that some people will, and they should if they want to, right? I think that some people are going to stop sharing their transness, and that is so valid. I know that I won't. I don't know how I could live by doing that. I also have to erase the internet, so that's, I don't know how to do that. Just like maybe I can ask the cell phone person if they know how to do that. But I'm not gonna stop sharing my transness, and a lot of that is because it's really important to me to continue to show up. And I think a lot of the activists that I look up to, especially other activists of color, Black activists, Indigenous trans activists, have been talking about making sure that we make it hell for this administration, and that means showing showing up. That means continuing to be ourselves. Now, there's a balance though, right? If we continuously show up, we burn out. I recently am coming off of almost a year-long, unintentionally a year, but almost a year-long break from social media. I posted like here and there, but I used to post like multiple times a week. I think I posted like 5 times all year. And that was so important for me. I was disengaging because I realized that my scrolling on the internet was really detrimental to my mental health, that being online and then having to produce content online meant I had to be constantly internalizing what was happening on the news, and it was just too much. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to take a couple weeks where I don't open Instagram. And then a couple weeks became a couple months, and then that became almost a year, and it's been beautiful. I recently, today, ended that by saying that I'm going to start posting more regularly, but it was because I took this almost year-long break to recoup that I feel actually ready to enter back. And I feel also really grateful that the timeline lined up to almost being inauguration. Because for me, I want my energy for January 20th. I want to be ready in this new year to get up and to fight. But in order to be getting up and fighting, I had to put it down for a lot of this past year. And so the answer to the question, it's a long answer, but the answer to the question is we really have to find times where we disengage. And what I think about that, the really like logistical recommendation that I'm going to make is actively log out. And then when you scroll, when you go look at the news, I'm not telling you don't do it, but when you do it, be very intentional. I am now consuming hatred. I am now consuming violence, right? Say this to yourself, because what you're doing is that. And if we tell ourselves and prepare ourselves, I'm going to go onto Instagram and I will probably consume violence, I will probably consume hatred, I will probably consume bigotry, I'm prepared for it, right? And maybe I need to do that because it's part of my job, or I want to know what's happening, and being aware is important. But we need to be intentional. This is what we're doing. We're not just scrolling on Instagram to see our friends, new shirtless post or whatever. We are actively consuming things that are harmful to ourselves, or at least we are consenting to doing so, right? So be mindful of that, and then make time to do that, and then make time to not do that. Yeah.
All right, we've got another one here. Our trans 8-year-old daughter loves to play soccer. We didn't bring her tonight because we were concerned the conversation would be too full of fear about the new administration. What words of encouragement, wisdom would you want us to share with her?
Yeah. So 8-year-olds are a heck of a lot more aware than I think we give them credit for. And if you're the parent of this 8-year-old, I'm sure you know that. I start with that because a lot of people will treat kids as if they shouldn't know what's going on. And I do think it's important to censor, information to some extent, but I also think it's important for you to talk to them about what's going on. Because realistically, they're already learning about it, they're hearing about it online, their school friends are talking about it, if they're on social media, which it might already be, they're consuming it, and if they're not on it at home, they're probably on it at school, right? They are actually consuming way more information than any of us here consumed when we were 8. And so be part of that information in a way that can actually be productive, can be kind, can be compassionate. You can create guardrails if you have the conversations with them. Right? So if I'm sitting with an 8-year-old and I coach 8-year-olds, actually I have a lot of parents of trans kids and trans kids that I have life coaching sessions with, and the kids will talk really, really clearly about what's happening in the world. So somebody is coming, I'll say, somebody is coming into the office who is not nice to us, and he doesn't like us, and he's not being nice to us. He's going to do X, Y, and Z things, and maybe I'll be specific, maybe I won't, depending on the conversation. And so this might sound really scary, and it's okay if you're scared, but we're going to figure this out. It's also only 4 years, and I know that sounds long because you're 8, that's half your life. Maybe don't say that part. But we're going to get through this, right? And actually, I want to show you all of these other trans people who've made it through this too. And then that's the really key part. You're transitioning from this is what's happening into the world to here's somebody who's like you and who's okay, right? I think one of the most valuable things that I've had the privilege of interacting with is other trans people who are older than me. Because I really didn't have any of that when I was younger. Most of the trans people that I know are my age or younger. And the first time I hung out with somebody who was over the age of 40 who was trans, I had dinner with this group of people, and there was a trans guy who was, I think he's 45. And I went home and I just cried. I just started sobbing when I went home, and I couldn't figure out why. I was like, what is going on? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the tears were coming from the safety that I felt with this guy, the future that I could imagine looking at him, and it sort of broke open to me. I hadn't been able to see myself in the future. But meeting this other trans person, a trans man who's also a man of color who was almost double my age, I thought, wow, he's lived into the future, maybe I can too. And so you can show an 8-year-old that. You don't need to say you're going to live into the future. That's probably a little too much. But you can say, hey, I know you're really scared, but look, there's this person I found online. They like something that you do, or they're similar to you in this way. And look, they're doing something you want to do when you grow up. That's it. You can show them that, and they're going to start to see themselves in the future. And that's going to give them so much hope to get through the next 4 years.
We have a lot of questions here about resources and how to find peer groups. This one I think kind of encapsulates it. My 32-year-old trans daughter is really struggling. She's become more and more isolated. Do you have resources or contacts for trans adults needing a healthy peer group?
Yeah, so this one's an easy one. I run 6 support groups a month online on Zoom, and they are in buckets of different identities. I have a trans plus, so anybody who identifies under the trans umbrella. I have an LGBTQ plus one. I have a trans mask specific one, a trans mask POC specific one, and then I have one that is a different one that's with a company called Folks Health, which is a telehealth company for trans and queer people, and they have one specific for if you're a Folks member. So I have a bunch of groups that I run. They are 18 plus because of it's basically liability issues. I can't have children come to the groups that don't have parental consent. So you do need to be 18 plus, but 32 is over 18, so that's great. So if you are a trans person or a queer person above the age of 18 or older, these groups are welcome to anybody all over the world. I have had probably 20 plus countries show up in my groups. Anywhere from 5 to 50 people show up to the groups. They're a really lovely space. And I think especially since the election, we've really been leaning into that space together because I think, again, reminding ourselves that we're here and that other people are surviving through this is really, really critical. So come to group, or tell your daughter to come to group.
Here's somebody who's been reading your book, but would like you to describe for everybody the feeling you had once you were able to be your true self.
So the first swim meet of the year when I was competing in the men's category, at that point we had already been training as a team for about a month and a half, and a lot of that time was very anxiety-provoking for me, I have to be honest. I was the one guy on the team who wore what's called jammers. I don't know how many, any swimmers in the room? Anybody? Okay, we've got a few. Okay, cool. So you all will know what I'm talking about. But for everybody else, jammers are the swimsuit that go to here, like they go to your knee. A Speedo, you all know what a Speedo is, yes? Yes, the tiny triangle, okay. So if you're above the age of like 10 in swimming, in the men's category in swimming, or the boys category in swimming, you wear a Speedo. It is very uncool to wear jammers, okay? So you wearing something to go to here is very uncool. And so nobody who's above the age of 15, especially not at an elite level, is wearing jammers except for like at a competition. So I was the only one on the team wearing jammers because I could not get myself to wear the tiny little Speedo. I was like just barely into my transition. I had gotten top surgery less than half a year before I started on the men's team. I had started testosterone like 2.5 months before I started the men's team. So I was brand new in my body in many ways. So the idea of exposing it down to a Speedo was way too much. So I'm trying to paint the picture. There was a lot of social anxiety I think I was experiencing at the time. But I will say that the first day I jumped into the pool with all the guys in my awkward, non-cool jammers, I remember just feeling like so much peace in the water. Like as soon as I got under the water, all the noise went away and I was just myself in the pool. And I think I had expected it to feel different from before I had transitioned, in that it was going to be this new, amazing, freeing experience, but what it felt like was just myself in the pool. And I think that's what's really special about swimming to me, is that it's a place where I don't have to have a gender. I don't have to be a specific version of myself. When I'm underwater, what's cool about swimming is you don't really see your own body. There's not like this experience, unless you're doing it wrong, you're not looking at your body. You're looking at the bottom of the pool, right? And maybe you see your fingertips, but mostly you're just the act of swimming. And so I think, it's an interesting question, reflecting on like the feeling of being myself, because it was a feeling I've always had. And I think that that's really, really critical. A lot of people assume that trans people wake up and become a new version of ourselves. And sure, there's newness to transition, and there's beauty, and there's this a new alignment that many of us experience, that I did too. But what was core when I went into the pool was actually this nakedness of me just being me. And that has always been part of my system and myself, and it's why I think my transness was not something that ever popped up and became true. It was something that I've always had within me. Maybe that's one of our 6 friends. Okay, go ahead.
I hope not. No, maybe I hope so. Do you have any suggestions on how to discuss trans issues or just being trans with friends or family who believe that trans folks are mentally ill or sick or wrong, etc.?
Yeah. Okay. This is a good question. So there's two buckets that I'll give you. The first is the very scientific answer, which is that when we talk about mental illness, or we talk about pathologizing identity, which is really what is happening, pathologizing, making an illness of trans identity. If we look historically speaking, there was pathologizing of trans identity. So it used to be called transsexualism, and then in 1984 it was gender identity disorder, and they have shifted. Now it is not actually considered a mental illness to be trans, but rather trans people might experience something called gender dysphoria, and that can be a mental illness because it can prevent significant clinical impacts basically on one's life, right? So the important thing is that right now in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it's a mouthful, but the book that we use to diagnose mental illness, which has a lot of problems with it just in the fact that it exists, but that book, it does not have transness in it. So categorically speaking, being trans is not a mental illness. And that's the same with the World Health Organization. There's nothing that says right now that being trans is a mental illness. So that if somebody's saying that, if I want science to prevail, I'll explain to them why they're incorrect. That usually doesn't work though. Right? The people who are saying this are really rooted into whatever they're believing, and they essentially need it to be a mental illness because for them being trans is so apparent and so it's abnormal that it has to be an illness, and that's their mindset. And so actually what I go to is, okay, so what if it is? Right? So what if it is? Okay, let's go down this route, because actually this is part of how I actually allowed myself to transition, was saying, so what if it is? Because very early on in my transition, when I really hadn't even begun transitioning, I had realized that I was trans. I was in an eating disorder rehab center in Miami, Florida, where I was going to this mental health treatment program. So I was mentally ill. I was struggling deeply with an eating disorder. That's why I was in rehab. I was trying to figure out why I was so sick. And I figured out that I was trans. And all of the things that I started researching online confirmed that, it was just a mental illness. There were so many sources that said, trans men are just girls with mental illness, are just girls with eating disorders, right? There's horrible things that people were writing about what felt like me online. And as I read this, and I thought, what would make me happy is this thing that everybody says is mentally ill. And then I got to a place where I was like, you know what? Fine, maybe it is a mental illness, but this is working for me. This is what make me happy. This is what is going to not harm anybody else. This is what's going to bring me what I need, right? Okay, fine. They can think that I'm a deranged woman. They can think that I'm mentally ill, but I actually know that I'm okay. And so there's actually this switch that I like to offer, which is, so what if I am? So what if it is? It doesn't hurt anybody, but I actually am happy, right? So sometimes I like to take their arguments and run with it and say, you know what? Fine, be that your truth. But my truth is this, and I actually am happy, and so if you're going to call me mentally ill, then that's a funny way to say that I'm happy, right? Sometimes this can work really well because people then don't have a response. There's not really much to say after that. You're mentally ill. Yeah, I just said that. Sure. I agreed with you, actually. Fine. But this is actually really good for me. When we look at categorical research, going back again to the bucket that I mentioned of science and facts, when we treat gender dysphoria with gender-affirming care, be that medical care or just verbally affirming people's gender, we see improvements in all measured outcomes, right? In mental health, lowered depression, lowered suicide rates, lowered self-harm, more sociality as well, right? We see improvements across the board. And so if we're going to think it's a mental illness, but then all of the mental illnesses go away when we actually affirm trans identity, we're not actually confirming that it's a mental illness, right? So all the data supports that being trans is not a mental illness, that gender diversity is widespread, that it is historically also present, that there have been always trans people in human populations, but people like to twist it, right? So then I say, fine, I am mentally ill, but I'm actually happy, so cool. Next question.
So along those same lines, we have someone who says, I'm a cisgendered man. I've often struggled understanding how people could feel themselves as a different gender. What does that feel like, and how did you know that you were a man?
Yeah. Okay, I love this question because I'm going to highlight one of the sentences. This person writes, I'm a cisgender man and I struggle to understand what it feels like to be something else. Okay, trans people feel the same way. And we have been forced for our whole life to be something that was different from what we know ourselves to be. So that feeling that this person is talking about in this question of, I don't know how I could imagine myself being different, that feeling is the same. That's what I felt my whole life, except that everybody else saw it differently. Everybody else told me, actually, you're in that box. But I was like, how is everybody putting me in that box? I'm here, right? How come they can't see me? How come when I tell people this is who I am, they don't believe me, right? That is pretty much every trans person's experience of we have felt this security in our knowledge of ourselves, but we've been continuously told that we're wrong. Right? Either implicitly by the ways that we're treated, or explicitly by parents and media and friends and people around us saying you're wrong about who you are. The more scientific answer to the question is that we don't actually have science to answer that question. We don't really know what is the biopsychosocial neurological underpinnings of gender identity. We have some relatively transphobic studies about this from like the 80s that are saying like it's a over testosterone exposed brain. There's a lot of theories that are kind of like wonky because again they're quite transphobic, and a lot of the people who did this research were very declaratively homophobic as well. But there's some science that is trying to say where our gender identities come from. What we do know, and we do have research about, is that if you try to change somebody's gender identity from what they say that they are, that's detrimental. And we have seen studies where there was a scientist who believed that somebody's gender identity was purely based on how they were raised. So if you're a woman because you were raised as a girl, and that's it. This is only based on incredibly narrow views of gender, of course, right? And so what he did was he said, okay, I'm going to just take a bunch of what would be assumed would be boys, and we're going to raise them as girls, and take a bunch of girls and raise them as boys. And what happened is most of those kids killed themselves, okay? Because it is devastating to be told constantly that you are not who you say you are. And that is the case for anybody. It's not just gender identity. It's not just trans people. If I consistently tell you what you know is true about yourself is wrong, that's called what? Gaslighting. It is manipulative, it is abusive, it is deeply dysregulating, especially to a young person. And when we consistently invalidate somebody, again, on anything, it doesn't have to be gender, it can be anything, we cause them to be really distrustful of themselves. And one of the most important things that I think that a parent can do to a kid is teach the kid to trust themselves. And so when we tell a kid, you're not who you say you are, we are teaching them consistently that they cannot trust themselves and they can't trust the parent either. Right? And that is deep-seated. That, especially when started young, that causes a really deep-seated fracture for that child and that person. This answer kind of went in many different directions from the original question of how do I know I'm a man? But I think what I'm trying to say is that we know that gender identity is something that usually starts very young and cannot be changed by outside forces. There are people who have fluid gender identities, and that's part of their experience. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, we cannot externally say you are something else than who you actually are. So if you know your own gender identity and you're like, gosh, I can't imagine ever being a different gender, great. That is exactly what trans people feel, right? We just didn't have the luxury of being affirmed in that for most of our lives.
All right, so I understand that you would like to wrap up with a story. So we're just going to take one more question of this very, very long list of questions so that we can get to your signing, where I think people will continue to ask you things.
Sure.
So people want to know about being a male to female athlete versus a female to male athlete in sports, and how there have been plenty of instances, or some instances, of male to female having some issues and having medals stripped and all of that. And can you talk about that a little bit? What's the difference?
Yeah. Okay, so this question comes in a lot of different forms. If you haven't heard it before, you're probably living under a rock. So the question, again, many different forms. It's always about fairness to some degree. Sometimes it's asking me about a specific person or something else. Usually it's, what about the opposite direction, Schuyler? Like you were a woman and now you're a man and you competed with the men and nobody cares. What about the other direction, right? So my first, and usually people are saying, there's a little bit of an edge of like, isn't it unfair? Aren't there biological somethings? So here's the thing I want to start with. If you can name a transgender woman who has won a national or international competition in any sport in the women's category, please raise your hand. If you can name at least one transgender woman who has won a national or international competition in the women's category in any sport at any point in the world history, raise your hand. Not quite, but that's good. It's good you know the name of Christine Jorgensen. Yes, she was not an athlete, but thank you. Yeah, very important transgender woman, one of the first people to undergo surgery in a public eye. Yes, that's a good name. Not an athlete, though. Anybody an athlete? Really? Not one? Okay, usually you've got one person. Okay, so look around. See how nobody's raising their hand? Okay, Sophie's got...
who just won the international darts tournament.
Great. Thank you. Love it. Okay. Usually we get Leah Thomas.
Can you repeat the name? The name?
Oh, yes. Noelle, I actually don't know her last name. Noelle Van Leeuwen. Great.
For darts.
For darts, yes. Noelle Van Leeuwen won the international darts tournament. I didn't know darts was separated into men's and women's categories, but anywho. Okay, so if you notice, nobody raised their hand, all right? Really important. I asked every audience I've ever spoken to this question, and I never have more than like 2 people raise their hand, and most of them can't even name a full name. They'll say, that person who I think it's Leah something. We don't really ever go to full name. So if transgender women were dominating the women's category, don't you think you could name a few of them? Yeah, maybe 1 or 2. Maybe 3 or 4. Okay, in the history of recorded sports, we have about 24 transgender women that I know of that have won national or international competitions. That's 24 women in the history of recorded sports, okay? Every Olympics, about 5,000 women compete. About 1% of the population is trans. If trans people were accurately represented, we would have 50 trans women every single Olympics. We have had 1 trans woman in the women's category in the history of the Olympics, all right? I start with these numbers because a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people think that transgender women are dominating sports, that medals are being stolen, that scholarships are being stolen. To my knowledge, there are very, very few. I know of like 2 trans women who have ever received scholarships, and I don't think even they're publicly out, okay? There are very, very few trans people that are actually competing in sports, largely because we are massively discriminated against, all right? But if we want to look at the science actually supports trans inclusion in sports. There was a research paper that came out reviewing 11 years of transgender women competing in elite level sports by the Canadian Centre of Ethics in Sports. And they actually cited that available evidence says that there is no advantage, no biological advantage that transgender women have over cisgender women when they undergo testosterone suppression. And testosterone suppression is required by every single major athletic association in order for trans women to compete in the women's category. So we have data, right? People are saying, well, there's no data. That's not true. There is data, and the data does support inclusion. But I also will say, if there wasn't data, how do we get it? You need them to play. You cannot say there's no data and then we can't study them, right? You actually need to include trans women in order to study what happens when trans women are included. But the data that we do have, right, for decades of having included transgender women before all of these bans came into place supports the inclusion of trans women. But I want to really focus on something actually next to the science, which is what happens in a society that is over-policing the women's category and women's bodies, because that's where we're at right now. Right? That's actually far more important than any of the science, because the science, again, supports trans people. We're going to move on from that because they're not listening to the science. The real concern is the way that people are talking about, we need to protect women's sports, we need to save women's sports by excluding trans women. What happens when you say this group of women is not women enough and this group of women is women enough? You need to measure everybody against what is woman enough. You need to police the entire category against some prototype of womanhood that you've decided is woman enough, and then you need to actually exclude based on that, because you can't just go say, well, you're trans, you get out. You don't know who's trans and who's not, right? So when we do that, we police every single woman's body in the women's category. And this is only furthering the marginalization and the disparity that already exists in women's sports. We do have a problem with not enough resources, not enough funding, not enough attention, right, for women's sports. We have deep issues in the amount of girls that are pushed out of sports from a young age because they've been bullied due to gender stereotypes. Right? Again, the gender binary, limiting people. These are real issues we have in women's sports. And unfortunately, the way that we are now trying to exclude trans girls and trans women only furthers that divide. right? They are spending millions of dollars to fight against trans people being included in sports. They could spend those millions of dollars funding women's sports, right? I think about that all the time where I'm like, oh my God, this, because when I went to watch Leah Thomas, who is a transgender woman who won the NCAA championships in 2022 in swimming 500-yard freestyle, she won that event and people flew from all over the world to protest her. And I was like, your flight ticket could have funded somebody to go to a women's sporting and you came to protest someone? Like, okay, anyways, we're gonna get really heated here. My point, people are not actually caring about women's sports. They care about control. They care about some old tradition, which is usually white supremacist, racist, transphobic, fatphobic, ableist, and all these other systems of who gets to be allowed womanhood, right? Who gets access to that category? Because if you look at other women who are currently being policed in the women's category who are not transgender, many of them are black and brown women. Serena Williams, Caster Semenya, Simone Biles, Sha'Carri Richardson, the list goes on. This past Olympics, if any of you all watched, we saw two women, both cisgender, both not transgender, both women of color, who were eviscerated online for being transgender, right? Called out by all of these major people saying, oh, these people are transgender. This is a man, and Donald Trump tweeted in all caps, he said, I will keep men out of women's sports. Iman Khalif is a woman. All right, so what's happening here, and the real danger of these anti-trans laws is that it affects all women, not just trans ones. It hurts all women, right? And especially those already most marginalized, like I already mentioned, like black women and brown women, all right, intersex women and so on. So when we talk about the trans sports conversation, it actually isn't about trans people, it's not about women, and it's not about sports. It is about control. And if we look at all the states that have the bans on trans people in sports, all the states that have bans on trans healthcare, all the states that are ratcheting up their censorship of Black History Month, censorship of critical race theory, defunding their DEI departments, and all the places that had trigger bans for reproductive rights, guess what? All the states, they're the same states. Those are the same states, those bills are written by the same people. So this is the same control. But what they're doing is they're dividing us because people think, oh, it's a trans issue, oh, it's a women's issue, and somehow they're, fighting against each other because a women's issue can't be a trans issue. But this is all the same thing. It's all body autonomy. It's all self-determination. And that's why I think it's so critical that we understand that all of these things are affecting all of us, right? That all of us have something to lose in this fight, and therefore all of us have something immense to gain in this type of liberation. I'm going to close with a story, and then I'll answer any other filtering questions that I can't. I can't answer all of them when we do books over there. But I want to tell you one last story. I mentioned, I'll start from the beginning. So my mom is Korean, like from the country, Korea, and my grandmother, my mom's mom, is actually North Korean. And she escaped from North Korea with her whole family when she was 13 years old. It was right before the war broke out and Korea was broken into the now two Koreas. And her family, when she was 13 years old, walked from Pyongyang, the capital of now North Korea, to Seoul to escape. Right? And this was like a multi-day journey, a horrific journey, and her family got separated. They had to find everybody. But my great-grandmother and my grandmother, 13 years old, led this walk, this exodus from North Korea. My mom was born in South Korea, and then they moved to the United States, the first of my family for 44 generations to leave the Korean peninsula, and they moved to the United States where I was born. I share this with you, again, starting from sort of my beginning, if you will, because very strong womanhood birthed me, brought me from North Korea to South Korea, all the way to the United States where I was born. My grandmother, my 할머니, is also very Catholic. Right? She's not only an immigrant, she's also very Catholic. She is Roman Catholic, but like Korean Roman Catholic, which is a special brand, and very religious, okay? And she, goes to Mass. It used to go to Mass every single week. Now it's multiple times a week because she has discovered Zoom Mass. And even more recently, she discovered YouTube Mass, which you can go asynchronously at any time. So sometimes when I go visit, we have to go watch the Pope and have Mass immediately. Anyways, very religious woman, okay? When I was coming out as transgender, I was terrified to tell her. And I actually ended up coming out on Facebook. I made this big post online because I was sick of telling everybody one at a time. I had individually told enough people, I'm transgender. The words stopped coming out of my mouth. So I was like, okay, make this big Facebook post, tell everybody and move on. So I made this big Facebook post, but my harmony, my grandmother, she has a Facebook. So I blocked her on Facebook. She calls it FaceTime, but it is Facebook. Anyways, I blocked her on Facebook, and I told all of her friends on Facebook, because she also has friends on Facebook, I said, please don't tell her I'm gonna get there. I spent about a month writing her a letter. I was trying to figure out the right language. I was trying to translate a little bit. I was trying to encapsulate this, it felt like so important thing I needed to tell her perfectly. And as I was looking online, looking for translations, I was like, okay, translation for transgender in Korean. It turns out that it is just transgender, said in a Korean accent. So it sounds like turensu chento, and gay, for example, is gay, which wasn't going to help at all. So instead of translating, I explained. I said, Harmony, grandmother, I'm telling you this because I love you, because I respect you, and because I desperately hope that you will understand. So I spent about a month writing this letter, and then my mom and I drove over to my grandmother's house. We lived like 5 minutes away. It was like a 20-minute drive because we took all the wrong turns on purpose. We were very nervous to get to that house. As we were like preparing, my mom was like, I think this could be the last time you speak to Harmony. This might be the last time we enter this house. I don't know how she's going to react, and I don't think it's going to be good. We were not optimistic. In fact, we were deeply pessimistic. I wasn't telling her because I thought things were going to go well. I was telling her because she had to know. I respect her enough that it had to come from me, and and that's it. That's all I was telling her because I was going to tell her. That's it. I didn't think it was going to go well. So we sat down at the kitchen table. It was my grandmother, my grandfather, my great aunt, and I begin to read them this letter. I repeat that I love them. I say, I'm telling you this because I love you, and then I waited. My grandfather, he began to clap. He had this like slow old man clap. And he goes, so, you come out of closet now. I was like, Harabaji, grandfather, excuse me? What? You barely speak English, but you have the words coming out of the closet? And he's like, congratulations. Both times with the hand movements. So we're stunned, right? We're not really sure what to say at this point. But we're also really waiting for my grandmother's response because Harabaji, while he is important, he is not, the matriarch of the house. And it's very clear that my grandmother is the one in charge. So we are waiting for Harmony's decree. My great aunt, she gives me a squeeze on my hand. She gets up to make tea. Her love has been communicated. Harmony's looking at me and she's got this really stern look on her face. She's like, and she says, I knew that. I was like, Harmony, what do you mean? I didn't know that. How did you know that? She's like, I knew that. Okay. I have 2 grandsons from your mother. That's fine. My mom has now burst into tears. I'm not quite there yet, though. I'm like, what is going on here? This is a little too simple. I am not quite sure what's going on. Harmony launches into this discussion of how it's normal that I'm transgender, all these things made me transgender. She's like citing all these things she's read online or watched on the internet somewhere, on YouTube or something, I don't know. She goes through all of this and she's like, oh, you have boy hormones. I'm like, Harmony, I actually don't have those. It's kind of part of the problem currently, but okay. So she goes through all this stuff. None of it's correct. It's all scientifically false, but that's okay. It got her there. She goes through all this and she's like, okay, you can be a boy and you can be a brother. She's like, oh, you can be a husband. I said, Harmony, I am 18. Let's slow down. She says, oh, you can be a doctor now. And I was like, okay, Harmony, we're going to have to come back to that one. She says, you can be a man, but in Korean culture, it is the daughter's responsibility to take care of the parents. And your mother has no daughters now. It is still your responsibility, Schuyler, to take care of your parents. So I actually have her words, pumo hyodo, it means mother, father, filial piety, or take care of your parents, tattooed in my grandmother's handwriting beneath my mastectomy scar next to my heart. And it's my tribute to my grandmother, my harmony, a tribute to my history, my culture, the people from which I come, a tribute to all the strong womanhood that birthed me. I'm the first of my Korean family to be born off of the Korean peninsula for 45 generations. It's a tribute to that deep tradition and history. It's a tribute to the daughterhood that I was assigned, never truly identified with, but the duties of which I absolutely will fulfill. I share this story with you all to close because I think sometimes people do leap over culture and faith and generation and language and everything my grandmother could have used to say no to instead say yes, to lead with love. My Korean immigrant grandmother had every excuse to put a barrier between us, but instead she said, I love you, be a doctor. But she said, I love you. And she has led with that love ever since. Unlike many of my family members who struggled with my pronouns, my grandmother somehow switched. Korean doesn't have gender pronouns, by the way. She somehow switched overnight on pronouns and defended me to my entire very extended Korean family in Korea. When we went to Korea a few years after my transition, she told everybody and took care of it. I didn't tell a single person. She said, I will tell them. And when we were traveling, I said, I'm scared. What if somebody says something? I don't have enough Korean to defend myself. She said, nobody's going to say anything. I said, but what if they do? She said, nobody's going to say anything. And nobody did. We had a beautiful time, and people cared more about what school I went to than the fact that I'm trans. That's a different story. Anywho, my point is that I think sometimes people surprise us. And I think sometimes it's worth giving them that space to surprise us. And I want to recognize and honor that in the world that we live in, the type of unconditional love that I've received from my Korean grandmother is a privilege. It shouldn't be. It should absolutely not be a privilege to have this kind of unconditional love, but it is. And so until the day when this is not a privilege, when it is common, ubiquitous, expected that we have this kind of love, I want you all to join me in that fight, right? Until that day when we can expect our loved ones to love us as they should, when we can love others the way that we should. But until that day, I hope that Harmony and my family can serve as this reminder of the unconditional love that each and every single one of us deserve and that we can all give to others. Thank you all so much for having me.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and thank you to the people who are watching at home. Schuyler will be signing out there, so please stop and buy a book and talk to him. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
My pleasure. Thank you.